Welcome back, dear listener, to another soft-spoken stroll through the shadows of the past. Whether the night is just beginning for you or you're listening as sleep slowly arrives, I'm happy you've chosen to spend this time here with me. Let me know in the comments, are you listening from somewhere far and quiet, or in the heart of a busy city winding down? And if these calming explorations bring a sense of rest, please consider subscribing. There are countless more voices from the past still waiting to be heard. In the year of our Lord 1347, as the Black Death begins its merciless march across Europe, we find ourselves in the bustling port city of Southampton. The narrow streets echo with the cries of merchants hawking their wares, the clatter of cartwheels on cobblestone, and beneath it all, the desperate whispers of those society has forgotten. Here, in a ramshackle building that leans precariously against its neighbours, we encounter Margot. Margot was once the daughter of a wool merchant, her childhood filled with the promise of a respectable marriage and a comfortable life. But fate, as it so often did in these unforgiving times, had other plans. When the wool trade collapsed and her father's debts mounted beyond redemption, Margot found herself cast out onto the streets at the tender age of 16. With no family to shelter her and no skills deemed valuable by society, she faced a choice that was no choice at all: starvation or survival by any means necessary. The medieval world offered precious few options for women without protection. Unlike the romanticized tales of chivalrous knights and noble ladies that populate our modern imagination, the reality for common women was stark and unforgiving. A woman alone was vulnerable to every predator, every scheme, every twist of fortune that could drag her down into the mire of destitution. For Margot, like countless others, the brothel became the last refuge. But this was no sanctuary of comfort or safety. Medieval brothels were establishments born of desperation and maintained through exploitation. They existed in the shadowy margins of society, tolerated by authorities who saw them as a necessary evil to prevent worse crimes, yet despised by the very people who frequented them. The building where Margot now found herself was typical of such establishments. 3 stories of rotting timber and crumbling mortar, with rooms barely large enough for a straw mattress and a rickety wooden stool. The walls were thin enough that every sound, every cry, every moment of anguish could be heard throughout the structure. Privacy was a luxury that did not exist in this world. The proprietress of this establishment was a woman known only as Mother Clemence, though there was nothing maternal about her demeanour. A former prostitute herself, Clemence had clawed her way up from the streets through cunning and ruthlessness. She ruled her domain with an iron fist wrapped in false compassion, always ready with honeyed words to lure desperate women into her web while extracting every coin of profit from their misery. When Margot first arrived at Mother Clemence's door, rain-soaked and hollow-eyed with hunger, she was greeted with what seemed like kindness: a warm meal, dry clothes, and a place to sleep, all offered freely to a girl who had nowhere else to turn. But nothing in this world came without a price, and Margot would soon learn that Mother Clemence's generosity was merely the first link in a chain that would bind her to this place. The debt began immediately. The meal, the clothes, the bed, all were carefully tallied in Mother Clemence's ledger. Then came the costs of staying: rent for the tiny room, payment for the coarse bread and thin ale that constituted most meals, fees for the services of the local physician when disease inevitably struck. With each passing day, the debt grew larger, and with it, Margot's desperation deepened. This system of debt bondage was the cruel mechanism that trapped women in brothels across medieval Europe. Unlike outright slavery, which was illegal in most Christian lands, this arrangement gave the appearance of voluntary servitude while being equally inescapable. The women technically owed money rather than their persons, but the debt was structured in such a way that it could never be fully repaid. The daily reality of life in Mother Clemence's establishment was a grinding cycle of degradation, and survival. Margot's day began before dawn, when she and the other women were roused to begin their preparations. There was no luxury of bathing. Water was expensive and often contaminated, so the women made do with rough cloths and whatever soap could be afforded. Their clothes were the cast-offs of more fortunate women, patched and repatched until they barely held together. The medieval understanding of hygiene was primitive at best, and in the close quarters of a brothel, disease spread with terrifying speed. Margot quickly learned to fear not just the violence of customers, but the invisible killers that lurked in every shadow. The sweating sickness could strike without warning, leaving a woman burning with fever and dead within days. The French pox, as syphilis was known, crept through the establishment like a slow poison, marking its victims with painful sores and eventual madness. But perhaps most dangerous of all were the frequent pregnancies that befell the women. In an age without reliable contraception, pregnancy was an occupational hazard that could spell doom. A pregnant woman could not work, yet her debts continued to accumulate. Those who survived childbirth faced the heartbreaking choice of abandoning their infants to foundling hospitals, where death rates exceeded 90%, or attempting to raise them in the brothel, exposing innocent children to horrors no young mind should witness. Margot watched as women around her succumbed to these various fates. There was Eleanor, barely 14 when she arrived, who died in agony from a botched attempt to rid herself of an unwanted pregnancy. There was Sarah, once a baker's wife, who lost her mind to the French pox and spent her final days speaking to invisible companions before disappearing one winter night, her body found frozen in an alley come spring. The customers who frequented Mother Clemence's establishment were a cross-section of medieval society's male population, united only in their willingness to exploit the desperate. There were merchants seeking release after long days of haggling, soldiers spending their meager pay on fleeting comfort, apprentices celebrating the completion of their training, and clergymen who spoke of sin on Sunday but indulged in it come Monday. Some customers were merely crude and demanding, treating the women as objects to be used and discarded. Others brought with them a violence that left lasting scars, both physical and mental. The medieval world was brutal in its casual acceptance of violence against women, and in the brothel, this violence was magnified by the understanding that these women had no protectors, no recourse, no voice that society would hear. Margot learned to read the signs, the set of a man's shoulders that suggested barely contained rage, the glassy look in the eyes that spoke of too much drink, the nervous fidgeting that might indicate a man's first time, and the unpredictable behavior that often accompanied such inexperience. Survival meant becoming an expert in human nature's darkest corners, learning to navigate between submission and resistance in ways that might preserve both life and sanity. The authorities' relationship with establishments like Mother Clemence's was one of calculated tolerance. Medieval society recognized that prostitution served certain functions. It provided an outlet for male desires that might otherwise be directed toward respectable women. It concentrated vice in controllable areas, and it generated revenue through various forms of taxation and regulation. In many cities, brothels were actually licensed and regulated by municipal authorities. Women were required to register with local officials, submit to periodic inspections by physicians, and pay taxes on their earnings. They were often required to wear distinctive clothing or badges that marked them as prostitutes, ensuring that respectable women would not be mistaken for them. These regulations were presented as protection for both the women and society at large, but in practice, they served mainly to further marginalize and control an already vulnerable population. The inspections were cursory and often corrupt, the taxes were burdensome additions to already crushing debts, and the requirement to wear identifying marks made it impossible for women to escape their circumstances and reintegrate into respectable society. For Margot, the weight of this social stigma was almost as crushing as the physical hardships she endured. Medieval Christianity taught that all souls could be redeemed through repentance, yet society offered no path for a woman who had fallen into prostitution to climb back to respectability. She was marked not just by her circumstances, but by the very knowledge of what she had been forced to become. The Church's attitude toward prostitution was complex and contradictory. While official doctrine condemned the practice as sinful, many theologians argued that brothels served as a necessary evil that prevented worse sins such as adultery or rape. St. Augustine himself had written that removing prostitutes from society would result in chaos, as uncontrolled lust would corrupt everything. This theological justification allowed medieval society to maintain brothels while simultaneously condemning the women who worked in them. The customers were seen as weak but forgivable. Men, after all, were understood to have natural urges that sometimes overcame their better judgment. The women, however, were viewed as temptresses who led men astray, willing participants in their own degradation who deserved whatever fate befell them. As the months passed in Mother Clemencee's establishment, Margot watched her reflection change in the cracked mirror that hung in her tiny room. The soft curves of youth hardened into sharp angles as inadequate food and constant stress took their toll. Her eyes, once bright with hope, became guarded and calculating. The innocent girl who had arrived seeking shelter was slowly dying, replaced by someone harder, more cynical, but perhaps more capable of survival. The other women in the house became her family of sorts, bound together by shared misery and mutual protection. They looked out for each other when possible, sharing information about dangerous customers, pooling resources to care for the sick, and providing what comfort they could in a world that offered little. These relationships were often the only source of genuine human connection in lives otherwise defined by exploitation and degradation. There was Agnes, a woman of perhaps 30 who had been in the house longer than anyone could remember. She had learned to navigate Mother Clemence's moods and the customers' demands with a skill born of desperate necessity. Agnes took Margot under her wing, teaching her the unspoken rules that governed their existence. Never show fear, even when terrified. Never trust completely, even those who seemed kind. And never ever let hope die completely, for hope was sometimes the only thing that kept them alive. The changing seasons brought different challenges to life in the brothel. Winter was perhaps the cruelest time, when the building's inadequate heating left the women shivering in their thin clothes, when customers became more violent and unpredictable due to the stresses of the season, and when disease spread even more rapidly through the crowded, poorly ventilated rooms. Spring brought relief from the cold, but also the annual influx of travelers and merchants as trade routes reopened. This meant more customers, but also more exposure to diseases carried from distant lands. Summer brought its own miseries. The stench of the city intensified in the heat. The building became stifling, and food spoiled quickly in the absence of proper preservation methods. Autumn was perhaps the most bearable season, when the harvest brought fresh food to the markets, and the cooling weather made life slightly more comfortable. But it also brought the knowledge that winter was coming again, that the cycle of hardship was about to begin anew. Throughout all of this, Margot clung to fragments of her former self. In quiet moments, she would remember her father teaching her to read, a skill that set her apart from most of the other women in the house. She would recall her mother's voice singing lullabies, the warmth of the family hearth, the security of a life where tomorrow was expected to be much like today. These memories were both comfort and torment. They reminded her that she had once been someone else, someone worthy of love and respect, but they also highlighted how far she had fallen and how impossible it seemed that she would ever reclaim that lost life. The economic realities of medieval urban life made escape from the brothel nearly impossible for most women. Even if they could somehow pay off their debts to Mother Clemence, where would they go? What honest work was available to a woman with no family connections, no guild memberships, no resources beyond her own desperate courage? The few legitimate occupations open to women, domestic service, textile work, food preparation, required references that former prostitutes could never obtain. The mark of their past would follow them wherever they went, ensuring that doors remained closed and opportunities denied. Some women attempted to escape anyway, fleeing in the night with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Most were quickly recaptured and returned to face Mother Clemence's wrath. Those few who managed to evade immediate capture often found themselves in even worse circumstances, reduced to begging or theft to survive, eventually dying in poverty, or returning voluntarily to the only life that offered even minimal security. The legal system offered no protection for women in Margot's situation. Medieval law recognized prostitution as illegal in theory while tolerating it in practice, creating a grey area where abuse flourished unchecked. Women could not bring charges against customers who violated or cheated them, could not seek protection from authorities who viewed them as criminals, and could not escape debts that had been structured to be unpayable. Mother Clemence maintained her control through a combination of economic manipulation, physical intimidation, and psychological warfare. She cultivated an atmosphere of fear and dependency, reminding the women constantly that they had nowhere else to go, that the world outside would treat them even worse than she did, that their only hope of survival lay in her continued goodwill. This psychological control was perhaps more effective than any physical restraint. The women policed themselves and each other, reporting infractions and suspicious behavior, competing for Mother Clemence's favor in hopes of slightly better treatment or marginally improved conditions. As Margot's first year in the brothel drew to a close, she found herself fundamentally changed by the experience. The innocent girl who had arrived seeking shelter had been replaced by someone harder, more calculating, but also more aware of the world's true nature. She had learned to survive in circumstances that would have destroyed many others, developing reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. But survival came at a cost that could never be fully calculated. The trauma of constant exploitation, the grinding poverty, the social isolation, and the daily confrontation with humanity's worst impulses had left scars that would never fully heal. Even if she somehow managed to escape this life, she would carry these experiences with her forever. The other women in Mother Clemence's house represented the full spectrum of this brutal existence. Some, like Agnes, had found ways to carve out small spaces of dignity and even limited power within the system. Others had been broken by their experiences, retreating into madness or addiction as escape from unbearable reality. A few had managed genuine escapes, marriage to customers who were willing to overlook their past, flight to distant cities where they might start anew, or, in rare cases, accumulation of enough resources to buy their freedom and establish themselves in legitimate trades. These success stories were held up by Mother Clemence as proof that the system worked, that patient endurance would eventually be rewarded, but they were so rare as to be practically mythical. For every woman who escaped, dozens more cycled through the brothel's doors, each bringing her own story of desperation and lost hope. Young girls barely past childhood, abandoned wives with no means of support, widows whose families had cast them out, foreigners fleeing war or persecution, all found their way to Mother Clemence's establishment, and all discovered that whatever hardships had driven them there, worse awaited within. The customers who frequented the brothel brought with them the full range of medieval society's attitudes toward women and sexuality. Some were genuinely kind, treating the women with a respect that was rare in their daily experience. Others were brutal and sadistic, using their economic power to inflict pain and humiliation with impunity. Most fell somewhere between these extremes, viewing the women as commodities to be consumed rather than human beings deserving of consideration. They brought their own frustrations and disappointments, their own pain and anger, and used the women as outlets for emotions they could not express elsewhere in their carefully regulated medieval lives. The diseases that plagued the brothel were a constant reminder of mortality in an age when medical knowledge was primitive and life expectancy short. Beyond the obvious venereal diseases, the women faced the same health challenges as all medieval urban dwellers: contaminated water, spoiled food, inadequate nutrition, and the ever-present threat of epidemic disease. The Black Death, which had already begun its devastating march across Europe, would soon reach Southampton, and when it did, establishments like Mother Clemence's would be particularly vulnerable. The close quarters, poor sanitation, and weakened immune systems of the residents would create perfect conditions for the plague to spread with lethal efficiency. But even without the threat of pandemic disease, life in the brothel was a daily confrontation with mortality. Violence, botched medical procedures, suicides, and simple exhaustion claimed women regularly. Bodies were disposed of quietly, often in unmarked graves, or simply dumped in the river, as if these women had never existed at all. The psychological toll of this existence was perhaps even more devastating than the physical hardships. The constant dehumanization, the daily reminders of powerlessness, the systematic destruction of self-worth, these created wounds that ran deeper than any physical injury. Margot found herself developing coping mechanisms that allowed her to survive psychologically. She learned to separate her mind from her body during the worst encounters, to retreat into memories of better times, to focus on small pleasures and victories that might sustain her through the darkest moments. The community of women within the brothel provided crucial emotional support, but it was also a source of additional stress. Competition for customers, disputes over money and possessions, jealousies and betrayals, all were amplified by the pressure cooker environment of their shared captivity. Friendships formed and dissolved with startling rapidity as women came and went, died or disappeared. Trust was a luxury that few could afford, yet human connection was essential for psychological survival. This tension created relationships that were simultaneously intimate and guarded, supportive and suspicious. As winter approached again, marking more than a year since Margot's arrival at Mother Clemence's establishment, she reflected on how completely her life had changed. The girl who had once dreamed of marriage and children, of a comfortable home and social respectability, had been replaced by someone whose primary concern was simply surviving until tomorrow. Yet even in the depths of this degradation, something essential remained. The spark of humanity that no amount of abuse could completely extinguish. The capacity for hope that persisted despite all evidence that hope was futile. The bonds of care and compassion that connected her to the other women who shared her fate. These were the qualities that made their suffering truly tragic. Not just the physical hardships they endured, but the waste of human potential. The destruction of lives that might have flourished under different circumstances. Each woman in Mother Clemence's house carried within her the ghost of who she might have been, and it was perhaps this awareness that made their situation most unbearable. The medieval world that had created and sustained this system of exploitation was not merely indifferent to their suffering, it was actively hostile to their existence as full human beings. They were seen as necessary evils at best, moral contaminants whose presence polluted everything around them. Yet they persisted, these forgotten women, finding ways to maintain their humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. They cared for each other when sick, shared what little they had when others were in need, and created small rituals and traditions that gave meaning to days that might otherwise have been unbearable. As the night fell over Southampton and the brothel prepared for another evening of business, Margot stood at her small window looking out at the city beyond. Somewhere out there were women sleeping safely in warm beds, protected by families and social conventions, their tomorrows secure and predictable. She envied them, But she also understood that the distance between their lives and hers was not as great as it might seem. A few wrong turns, a bit of bad luck, the death of a protector, or the collapse of a family's fortunes. Any of these could have brought those respectable women to the same desperate circumstances that had claimed her. This understanding brought no comfort, but it did provide a kind of clarity. The system that had trapped her was not natural or inevitable. It was a human creation, sustained by human choices and human indifference. And if humans had created it, perhaps humans could also change it, though such change seemed impossibly distant from her current reality. For now, survival was enough. Each day she remained alive was a small victory against forces that seemed determined to crush her completely. Each moment of kindness shared with another woman was an act of rebellion against a world that insisted they were beneath consideration. And in the deepest part of the night, when the customers had gone home and the brothel fell into temporary quiet, Margot would sometimes allow herself to dream. Not of escape. That seemed too impossible to contemplate. But of small improvements, tiny changes that might make tomorrow slightly more bearable than today. These dreams were modest beyond imagining. A day without violence, a customer who treated her with basic human decency, a moment of genuine laughter shared with another woman, a night of sleep uninterrupted by nightmares. In a life stripped of almost everything, these fragments of hope were precious beyond measure. The candle in her room burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls as Margot prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new degradations, new tests of her ability to endure. But tonight, for this brief moment, she was still herself, still Margot, daughter of a wool merchant, still capable of thought and feeling and hope. In the morning, the brutal cycle would begin again. But for now, in the gathering darkness of a medieval night, she held on to the one thing that no amount of suffering could completely destroy: the irreducible core of human dignity that made her more than the sum of her circumstances, more than the role that society had forced upon her. This was the reality of life as a brothel woman in medieval times. Not just the physical hardships and social degradation, but the daily struggle to maintain one's humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. It was a battle fought not with swords or shields, but with small acts of kindness, moments of connection, and the stubborn refusal to let despair have the final word. As we close this first chapter of Margot's story, we leave her in that small room, candle burning low, dreams and nightmares warring in her mind. Her journey through this brutal world has only just begun, and the trials ahead will test every reserve of strength and courage she possesses. But she endures, as countless women like her endured, carrying within themselves the seeds of a dignity that no amount of suffering could completely destroy. Looking at your summary and the reference materials, I can see you need part 2 of your brutal life as a brothel woman in medieval times that continues from where part 1 left off. Based on the established tone and content, here's the continuation. The stench hit you first. Always the stench. A nauseating cocktail of unwashed bodies, stale ale, and human waste that clung to your clothes and hair like a curse you couldn't escape. Even now, months after arriving at the brothel, your stomach still churned when that familiar miasma filled your nostrils each morning. But there was no time to dwell on discomfort. The day had already begun, and with it came the endless parade of men who saw you as nothing more than a vessel for their desires. Each knock on your door brought another stranger, another violation, another coin that would barely keep you alive, but never buy your freedom. The brothel keeper, a corpulent woman named Agatha, whose smile never reached her cold eyes, made her morning rounds with the precision of a tax collector. She counted every coin, examined every bruise, and noted every complaint from customers with the detached efficiency of someone who had long ago abandoned any pretense of humanity. "You're looking peaked again, girl," she would say, her thick fingers pinching your chin with surprising strength. "Can't have you scaring off the paying customers with that sour face. Remember, they're not just buying your body, they're buying the fantasy that you enjoy it." The fantasy. That cruel deception that you learned to perform with the skill of a court jester, painting smiles over tears and moans of pleasure over cries of pain. Your survival depended on this performance, this elaborate charade that convinced men they were lovers rather than purchasers, that you were willing rather than trapped. But the physical degradation was only the beginning of your torment. The constant fear of pregnancy haunted every encounter, knowing that bearing a child in this place would doom both mother and infant to even greater suffering. The crude methods of prevention, bitter herbs that made you violently ill, dangerous procedures performed by women with dirty hands and dubious knowledge, often proved worse than useless. When pregnancy did occur, as it inevitably did for most women in the brothel, the choices were uniformly grim. Some attempted to end the pregnancy through violent means, risking death from infection or blood loss. Others carried to term, only to watch their children sold into slavery or abandoned to the streets. A precious few managed to convince a customer to claim the child as his own, though this rarely led to any improvement in the mother's circumstances. The women who survived pregnancy often found their bodies permanently damaged, their earning potential diminished, their already precarious position made even more vulnerable. Agatha showed no mercy to those whose injuries made them less desirable to customers. They were relegated to serving the poorest clients, given the most dangerous assignments, or simply cast out to starve. Disease stalked the brothel corridors like a hungry wolf, claiming victims with terrifying regularity. The French pox, as syphilis was known, rotted faces and minds with equal cruelty. Gonorrhea left women writhing in agony, their bodies burning with infection. Consumption wasted them away slowly, each cough bringing up more blood until they could no longer work and were left to die in whatever corner they could find. The lack of any real medical care meant that even minor ailments could prove fatal. A small cut could fester into a life-threatening infection. A difficult birth could result in bleeding that no one knew how to stop. The crude remedies available, mercury for the pox, bloodletting for fever, prayers for everything else, often did more harm than good. Yet perhaps the cruelest torture was the systematic destruction of hope itself. New arrivals, like you had once been, often clung to the belief that their situation was temporary, that they would find a way to escape or buy their freedom. The older women, those who had survived years in this hell, took a perverse pleasure in crushing these dreams. "You think you're different," they would whisper with bitter laughter. "You think your story will end differently than ours. But look around you, girl. Look at what we've all become. This is your future, written in scars and shame." They spoke of women who had tried to escape, only to be dragged back and beaten so severely they never walked properly again. They told stories of girls who had saved every coin for years, only to have their hidden stash discovered and confiscated. They recounted the fates of those who had tried to find honest work, only to be turned away by respectable society and forced to return with their tails between their legs. The legal system offered no protection, no recourse for women in your position. In fact, the law often worked against you. Prostitution existed in a grey area of medieval jurisprudence, sometimes tolerated, sometimes punished, but always stigmatized. Women could be fined, imprisoned, or subjected to public humiliation for their involvement in the trade, while their customers faced little or no consequence. The church's condemnation was equally harsh and hypocritical. While priests thundered from their pulpits about the sins of fallen women, many of those same clerics were regular visitors to the brothel. They arrived under cover of darkness, their faces hidden by deep hoods, their piety conveniently forgotten as they indulged in the very behaviors they publicly denounced. This hypocrisy extended throughout medieval society. The same merchants who crossed themselves piously in church would haggle over prices with Agatha like they were buying livestock. Knights who swore oaths of chivalry and protection of women would treat the brothel inhabitants with casual cruelty. Judges who sentenced prostitutes to public shame would return as customers the following week. The few attempts at regulation that existed were designed not to protect women like you, but to control and profit from your misery. Some cities required brothels to operate only in designated areas, often the most squalid and dangerous parts of town. Others imposed licensing fees and taxes, treating the trade as just another form of commerce while doing nothing to improve conditions for the workers. Your daily routine became a grinding cycle of degradation and endurance. Dawn brought the first customers, often drunk men who had spent the night in taverns and wanted to cap off their revelry. These encounters were frequently violent, as alcohol had stripped away what little restraint these men might have possessed when sober. Midday brought a different clientele. Merchants conducting business in the area, craftsmen taking a break from their labours, soldiers on leave from their duties. These men were often in a hurry, treating the transaction with the same efficiency they might show when buying bread or having their shoes repaired. Evening was perhaps the worst time, as the brothel filled with groups of men emboldened by numbers and drink. They would make sport of humiliating the women, competing to see who could be most creative in their cruelty. These group encounters often left lasting physical and emotional scars that never fully healed. The economic reality of your situation was designed to ensure permanent servitude. Every meal, every piece of clothing, every candle used in your room was charged against your supposed earnings. The interest on your original debt compounded daily, growing faster than you could ever hope to pay it down. Agatha kept meticulous records of these mounting obligations, ensuring that no woman could ever claim to have worked off what she owed. Even the coins you earned were subject to countless deductions. A percentage went to Agatha for room and board. Another portion was claimed for protection from the local guards who were paid to look the other way. Medical expenses, such as they were, came out of your share. Fines for breaking house rules or displeasing customers ate away at what little remained. The psychological manipulation was as carefully orchestrated as the financial exploitation. Agatha was skilled at playing the women against each other, creating hierarchies and rivalries that prevented any unified resistance. New arrivals were placed under the supervision of more experienced women, who were rewarded for keeping their charges in line and punished if anyone under their watch caused trouble. This system bred a toxic environment where trust was a luxury none could afford. Information about escape attempts or hidden savings would be traded for small favors or slightly better treatment. Friendships were constantly tested by the brutal calculus of survival, as helping another woman might mean your own destruction. Yet somehow, in the depths of this nightmare, small acts of humanity persisted. A woman sharing her meager food with someone too sick to work. Another teaching a newcomer the subtle tricks that might help her avoid the worst violence. Whispered conversations in the dark about dreams of freedom, about lives that might have been, about families left behind. These moments of connection were precious beyond measure, brief respites from the crushing isolation and despair that defined daily existence. They reminded you that beneath the forced smiles and performed pleasure, real human beings still struggled to survive with whatever dignity they could preserve. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life brought their own particular challenges to brothel existence. Winter was the harshest time, as the poorly heated buildings offered little protection from the bitter cold. Fuel was expensive, and Agatha was not inclined to waste money on the comfort of her workers. Many women developed chronic coughs and joint pain from the constant cold and damp. Spring brought its own miseries, as the melting snow and seasonal rains turned the unpaved streets into rivers of mud and filth. The brothel's location, in the least desirable part of town, meant it was often flooded with this noxious mixture, bringing disease and making an already unsanitary situation even worse. Summer's heat intensified every unpleasant smell and made the crowded conditions nearly unbearable. The lack of proper ventilation meant that the stench of sweating bodies and human waste became overwhelming. Flies and other insects swarmed constantly, spreading disease and adding another layer of misery to daily life. Autumn brought the spectre of winter's approach, a time when customers became fewer and more violent as their own struggles with cold and hunger intensified. It was also harvest time, when many of the local men who formed the brothel's regular clientele were busy with agricultural work, leading to reduced income and increased pressure to accept more dangerous customers. The justice system's treatment of crimes against brothel women revealed the complete devaluation of their lives in medieval society. Violence that would be severely punished if committed against a respectable woman was often ignored entirely when the victim worked in a brothel. Rape, assault, and even murder were treated as occupational hazards rather than serious crimes deserving investigation and punishment. This lack of legal protection created an environment where the worst elements of society knew they could indulge their darkest impulses without consequence. Serial killers, sadists, and the violently mentally ill were drawn to brothels like moths to flame, knowing they could satisfy their urges on victims society had already written off as worthless. The few instances where justice was pursued usually involved crimes against property rather than persons. A customer who stole money or damaged the brothel's furnishings might face prosecution, while one who tortured or killed a woman would likely walk away without even a reprimand. This systematic dehumanization was reinforced by the language used to describe women in your situation. Legal documents referred to prostitutes as common women or women of ill fame, terms that stripped away individual identity and reduced complex human beings to their supposed moral failings. Religious texts spoke of them as vessels of sin, tempters leading good men astray, devils in human form. The economic structure of medieval society made your predicament almost inevitable for women without family protection or independent means of support. The guild system that dominated urban crafts was largely closed to women, who were barred from most skilled trades and professional occupations. Agricultural work was backbreaking and poorly paid, offering little hope of economic independence. Marriage, while theoretically offering protection and security, was itself a form of economic transaction where women were transferred from father to husband like valuable property. Those without dowries or family connections found themselves with few options when circumstances forced them to fend for themselves. The rise of urban centres in the later medieval period had created new opportunities for some women, but also new forms of exploitation. Cities drew desperate people from the countryside with promises of work and prosperity, but many found only poverty and degradation waiting for them in the crowded, unsanitary urban environment. Your story, tragic as it was, represented just one thread in a vast tapestry of suffering that characterized women's lives throughout the medieval period. Yet within that suffering lay seeds of resilience and resistance that would eventually bloom into movements for women's rights and human dignity. The courage required simply to survive each day in such circumstances was itself a form of heroism that deserves recognition and remembrance. As night fell over the brothel once again, bringing with it another cycle of exploitation and endurance, you held on to whatever fragments of hope you could find. Perhaps in dreams of escape, in memories of better times, or simply in the knowledge that you had survived another day in a world designed to destroy you. These small victories, invisible to those who profited from your misery, were the building blocks of a strength that no amount of cruelty could completely extinguish. Part 3. The daily torment of Margot's existence. The pre-dawn darkness clung to the narrow alleyways like a shroud as Margot stirred from her fitful sleep on the straw-filled mattress she shared with 2 other women. The brothel never truly slept. Even in these quiet hours before sunrise, she could hear the muffled sounds of commerce from the rooms below, the creaking of floorboards, and the occasional cry that might have been pleasure or pain. In this world, the distinction had long since blurred into irrelevance. Her body ached in ways that had become as familiar as breathing. The persistent soreness between her legs, the bruises that painted her ribs in shades of purple and yellow, the tender spots on her wrists where rough hands had gripped too tightly. Each mark told a story she would rather forget, yet her skin had become a living ledger of her degradation. Entries made nightly in currency she never chose to spend. The other women began to stir as well. There was Agnes, barely 16, but already hollowed out by 6 months in this place, her once bright eyes now holding the glassy stare of someone who had learned to retreat deep inside herself during the worst moments. Beside her lay Catherine, older at perhaps 25, a veteran of this trade who had arrived 3 years ago with a debt that somehow never seemed to decrease despite her nightly labours. The mathematics of their bondage were deliberately obscured, interest compounding faster than their earnings could ever hope to match. "Another day in paradise," Catherine muttered, her voice hoarse from the previous night's work. She sat up slowly, wincing as she pressed a hand to her lower back. A difficult client had been particularly rough, demanding positions that left her feeling as though she'd been trampled by horses. But complaints were not tolerated. The brothel keeper, Madame Heloise, made it clear that their job was to accommodate whatever was requested, no matter how degrading or painful. Margot had learned this lesson during her first week, when she had dared to protest a client's desire to bind her hands so tightly that her fingers went numb. The beating she received from Heloise's enforcer had left her unable to work for 3 days, during which her debt had continued to accumulate. She was charged for her room, her meals, even the salve used to treat the wounds inflicted as punishment. It was a perfect system of control. Resistance only deepened their bondage. The morning routine began with a cold wash from a shared basin of murky water. Privacy was another luxury stripped away. They bathed together, tended to each other's wounds, and examined themselves for signs of the diseases that stalked these establishments like hungry wolves. A rash here, an unusual discharge there, a persistent cough that might herald something far worse. These were the constant fears that haunted their waking hours. Margot ran her fingers along her throat, checking for the swollen glands that might indicate the onset of the sweating sickness. Several women had disappeared from the brothel in recent months, supposedly sent away to recover, but everyone knew the truth. Disease was bad for business, and sick women were simply discarded like spoiled meat. The lucky ones died quickly. Others lingered in whatever hovel would take them, slowly wasting away as their bodies betrayed them one organ at a time. The breakfast, if it could be called that, consisted of thin gruel made from scraps and water, occasionally enriched with a bit of fat or a fragment of vegetables past their prime. The portions were deliberately meagre. Hunger kept them compliant, desperate enough to endure anything for the promise of an extra crust of bread or a small coin they might keep for themselves. Margot had learned to eat slowly, to savour even this inadequate meal, for there was no guarantee when the next would come. As she ate, she listened to the other women share intelligence about the previous night's clients. This information was crucial for survival. Which men were violent, which had peculiar demands, which might be generous with extra payment if properly pleased. They spoke in the coded language of their profession, references that would be meaningless to outsiders, but carried vital information for those who depended on such knowledge to navigate each night's dangers. "The merchant with the silver rings was back," whispered Agnes, touching a fresh bruise on her cheek. "He's getting worse. Last night he—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but the look in her eyes conveyed enough. They all knew which merchant she meant, a well-respected trader who maintained a respectable facade in daylight, but revealed his true nature in the brothel's shadows. The irony was not lost on any of them. The very men who might publicly condemn their profession, who attended church services and spoke of virtue and morality, were often their most regular clients. Priests, merchants, nobles, craftsmen, all came seeking the services that society simultaneously demanded and despised. The women who provided these services bore the weight of this hypocrisy, branded as sinners while servicing the supposed righteous. Catherine shared news of a different sort. "I heard from one of the girls at the Blue Swan that they're planning to raise their rates. Madame Heloise won't like being undercut." This was ominous news. When brothels competed, it was the women who suffered. Rates might be raised to match competitors, but their share remained the same, while their debt somehow found new ways to expand. Or worse, they might be forced to offer services they had previously refused in order to attract clients willing to pay premium prices. The morning also brought the daily reckoning with Madame Heloise herself. This woman, perhaps 50 years old with hard eyes and a mouth that seemed incapable of genuine warmth, maintained iron control over every aspect of their lives. She moved through the brothel like a general inspecting troops, noting which women looked tired, which bore too many visible marks, which might need to be temporarily removed from service to heal. Margot stood for inspection along with the others, arms at her sides as Eloise examined her like livestock at market. The woman's cold fingers tilted Margot's chin to check for new bruises, pulled back her lips to examine her teeth, ran hands along her body to assess her condition. It was a violation in itself, this clinical assessment of her worth as a commodity, but resistance was not an option. "You're looking thin," Eloise observed, her voice carrying the tone of someone noting a problem with a piece of equipment. "Eat more. The clients prefer women with some flesh on their bones." As if Margot had any control over the meager rations provided, as if the constant stress and frequent illnesses didn't naturally waste away their bodies regardless of their desires. The evaluation continued with questions about the previous night's work. How many clients, any problems, any special requests that might command higher fees? Margot answered in the flat, emotionless tone she had perfected. Enthusiasm was not expected, merely compliance and basic competence. She reported that one client had paid extra for her to pretend to be his deceased wife, complete with using the dead woman's name during their encounter. Such requests were not uncommon. The brothel served as a repository for men's darkest fantasies and most shameful desires. Heloise made notes in her ledger, the same book that tracked their debts and earnings. Margot glimpsed her own entry, a column of numbers that somehow never seemed to decrease despite her nightly labor. The cost of her room, her food, her clothing, the percentage taken by the house, the mysterious fees that appeared without explanation, the mathematics of exploitation, carefully maintained to ensure that freedom remained forever out of reach. The day hours brought a different kind of torment. The waiting. While some clients preferred afternoon visits, most of their business occurred after darkness fell. This left long hours to fill, time that stretched endlessly when filled with nothing but anticipation of the night's degradations. Some women slept, exhausted from their nocturnal labors, but Margot often found sleep elusive during daylight hours. Instead, she would sit by the small window in their shared room, watching the normal world go about its business beyond the brothel's walls. She saw merchants setting up their stalls, housewives haggling over prices, children playing in the streets. All the ordinary activities of people whose bodies belong to themselves. It was a form of torture, this glimpse of the life she had lost, yet she could not stop herself from looking. Sometimes she would see women her own age, dressed in clean clothes and walking freely through the streets. She wondered what their lives were like, whether they appreciated their freedom or took it for granted as she once had. Did they know how easily it could all be stripped away? How quickly circumstances could reduce a person to a commodity to be bought and sold? The afternoon brought preparations for the evening's work. This involved elaborate rituals of beautification designed to create the illusion that they were something other than what they truly were. Margot would carefully apply the cosmetics that Heloise provided. Rouge for her cheeks and lips, kohl for her eyes, perfumed oils to mask the sense of fear and desperation that seemed to cling to her skin. The clothing was equally calculated. Dresses cut low to display their bodies, fabrics chosen more for their ability to be quickly removed than for comfort or warmth. Everything was designed to present them as objects of desire rather than human beings with their own thoughts and feelings. The transformation was both necessary for business and deeply dehumanizing. Each night, they were required to bury their true selves beneath this elaborate disguise. As evening approached, the atmosphere in the brothel would shift. The languid pace of afternoon gave way to tense preparation. Clients would begin arriving as the sun set, and the women would take their positions in the main room downstairs. This common area served as a marketplace where men could survey their options, examining the available women like buyers at a horse fair. Margot had learned to school her expression during these displays, to appear welcoming without seeming desperate, available without appearing too eager. The balance was delicate. Men wanted to feel desired, but they also wanted to maintain the fiction that they were in complete control. Too much enthusiasm might suggest insincerity, while too little might imply reluctance that could dampen their ardor. The clients themselves were a study in human complexity and contradiction. There were the regulars who developed preferences for particular women, returning week after week to enact the same rituals of dominance and submission. Some were surprisingly gentle, seeking companionship as much as physical release, treating the women with a kindness that made their situations somehow more heartbreaking rather than less. Others were cruel by nature or design, men who seemed to take particular pleasure in the power dynamic that the brothel provided. These clients would make deliberate efforts to humiliate and degrade, as if the simple transaction of money for services was insufficient to satisfy their need for dominance. They would demand that the women perform acts that served no purpose beyond reinforcement of their subjugation. Margot had learned to retreat mentally during the worst encounters, to send her consciousness somewhere else while her body endured whatever was required. It was a survival mechanism that many of the women developed, a form of dissociation that allowed them to preserve some core part of themselves, even as their physical forms were violated and degraded. But this psychological defense came with its own costs. The more she retreated from her body during these encounters, the more disconnected she became from physical sensation altogether. Food lost its taste, sunshine felt distant, even pain seemed muffled and remote. She was becoming a ghost inhabiting her own flesh, present but not truly alive. The nights blurred together in a haze of anonymous faces and repetitive degradations. Each client brought his own particular requirements and fetishes, his own way of exercising the power that his coins had purchased. Some wanted her to play roles: the innocent maiden, the experienced temptress, the grieving widow, the eager servant. Each persona required her to fragment herself further, to become whatever fantasy the client needed her to embody. Between clients, there were brief moments to clean herself, to check for injuries, to prepare for the next encounter. These interludes were both relief and torment, relief from the immediate demands on her body, but also time for her mind to process what she had just endured and what was yet to come. The nights stretched endlessly, each hour marked by another violation, another small death of dignity and self-respect. The other women moved through their own versions of this nightmare, each coping in her own way. Agnes had begun talking to herself in a constant whisper, carrying on conversations with people who existed only in her increasingly fragmented mind. Catherine had developed a hard cynicism that seemed to protect her, but also isolated her from any possibility of human connection. Others simply went through the motions with mechanical precision, their spirits having long since fled to whatever refuge they could find. Dawn brought temporary reprieve, but also the crushing realization that it would all begin again the next night, and the night after that. And every night thereafter, until disease, violence, or sheer exhaustion finally provided the only escape that seemed possible. The future stretched ahead like an endless tunnel, dark and airless, offering no glimpse of light or hope. Yet even in this abyss, small acts of humanity persisted. The women cared for each other when they could, sharing remedies for injuries, offering comfort during the worst moments, creating tiny islands of compassion in an ocean of cruelty. These gestures were acts of rebellion against a system designed to strip away their humanity, proof that even in the depths of degradation, the human spirit could find ways to assert its presence. Margot treasured these moments of connection, hoarding them like precious gems against the poverty of her existence. A gentle touch from Catherine when she was injured, a shared joke with Agnes during a rare moment of levity, the simple act of braiding another woman's hair. These small intimacies reminded her that she was still human, still capable of both giving and receiving kindness. But such moments were fleeting, overwhelmed by the relentless machinery of exploitation that ground them down day after day. The brothel was a perfect system of control, designed to extract maximum profit from human misery, while maintaining the illusion that the women were there by choice. Every aspect of their existence was calculated to reinforce their powerlessness, to convince them that resistance was futile and escape impossible. As Margot lay down for another few hours of restless sleep, her body aching and her spirit battered, she could not help but wonder how much longer she could endure this existence. Each night took something from her that could never be recovered. Each violation carved away another piece of the person she had once been. She was being consumed slowly, methodically, like a candle burning down to nothing. Yet somewhere deep inside, a tiny flame of defiance still flickered. Perhaps it was nothing more than the biological imperative to survive, but it felt like something more. A stubborn refusal to be completely erased, a determination to remain human despite all efforts to reduce her to a mere object. This flame was all she had left of herself, and she guarded it jealously against the forces that sought to extinguish it forever. The medieval world offered no safety net for women like Margot, no social services or charitable organizations designed to help them escape their circumstances. The church, which might have been expected to offer sanctuary, was often complicit in their exploitation, taking its share of the profits while publicly condemning the very industry it helped sustain. The legal system provided no protection for women who existed outside the bounds of respectable society, and the economic structures of the time made it virtually impossible for them to accumulate the resources necessary for escape. This was the brutal reality of Margot's existence, trapped in a system designed to exploit her completely while offering no legitimate path to freedom. Each day brought the same cycle of degradation and survival. Each night the same parade of men who saw her not as a human being, but as a receptacle for their desires and a target for their aggression. In this world, women like Margot were disposable commodities, used until they were broken and then discarded without ceremony or regret. Yet she endured, as countless women before her had endured, finding ways to preserve some essential part of herself even in the face of systematic dehumanization. Her story was one of thousands, each a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even under the most crushing circumstances. In remembering her suffering, we honor not only her memory, but the memories of all those who faced similar fates in a world that offered them no mercy and no escape from the brutal mathematics of survival. Part 4. The Descent into Desperation. The first pale rays of dawn crept through the narrow window slats of the brothel, casting sickly shadows across Margot's bruised face. 3 months had passed since she'd first stepped through these cursed doors, and each day had chipped away another piece of her soul. What had begun as desperate survival had transformed into something far more sinister. A systematic destruction of everything she had once been. The autumn air carried the stench of the nearby tannery, mixing with the perpetual odours of unwashed bodies, cheap wine, and the acrid smoke from poorly maintained oil lamps. Margot pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the familiar ache in her ribs where a particularly violent customer had kicked her the night before. The pain had become as constant as breathing, a dull reminder of her new reality. "Up, you worthless sow!" Madame Heloise's voice cut through the morning gloom like a rusty blade. The older woman stood in the doorway, her face a map of cruelty etched by years of managing human misery. "Lord Aldrich's son will be arriving within the hour, and he's specifically requested you. Clean yourself up and try not to look like you've been trampled by horses." Margot struggled to her feet, ignoring the shooting pain that ran down her left leg. A drunken merchant had twisted it badly 2 nights prior, and it hadn't healed properly. Nothing healed properly in this place. The constant dampness, the poor food, and the relentless physical abuse had left her body in a state of perpetual breakdown. She limped toward the cracked basin in the corner, where a thin layer of ice had formed over the dirty water. The cold bit into her skin as she splashed her face, washing away the dried blood from her split lip. In the warped reflection of the water's surface, she barely recognized the hollow-eyed creature staring back at her. Her once lustrous dark hair had grown thin and brittle, her cheeks sunken from malnutrition, her eyes vacant pools that had seen too much. The sound of retching came from the next room, where Lisette was experiencing her usual morning sickness. The girl was perhaps 4 months along now, her belly beginning to show beneath her worn kirtle. Madame Heloise had been furious when she'd discovered the pregnancy, beating Lisette so severely that the girl couldn't work for 3 days. But pregnancy meant lost income, and lost income meant punishment for everyone. "At least when the babe comes, we'll know what to do with it," Heloise had sneered. And Margot shuddered to think what fate awaited Lisette's unborn child. She'd heard whispers of infants sold to beggars, who would deliberately maim them to make their pleas for charity more pitiful or worse, of babies who simply disappeared into the night, never to be spoken of again. The heavy footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of young Lord Aldrich. Margot's stomach clenched with familiar dread. The nobleman's son was barely 18, with the cruel appetites of youth and the protection of his father's title. He delighted in causing pain, and his visits always left Margot injured in new and creative ways. She'd learned to hide the worst of the damage, knowing that visible wounds would only earn her further beatings from Madame Heloise. "Smile, you miserable wretch," Heloise hissed, shoving Margot toward the door. "And remember, 1 word of complaint to anyone, and I'll have Claude take you to the cellar. You know what happens in the cellar." Margot did know. She'd seen Marie dragged down there 3 weeks ago after she dared to refuse a customer who wanted to brand her with a hot iron. When Marie finally emerged 2 days later, she was different, broken in a way that went beyond the physical. She barely spoke now, moving through her days like a walking corpse, her spirit completely shattered. The cellar was Madame Eloise's ultimate weapon of control. It was where the most brutal punishments were carried out, where women were tortured until they begged for death, where the last vestiges of hope were systematically destroyed. The very mention of it was enough to ensure compliance from even the most defiant girls. As young Lord Aldrich entered the room, his pale eyes gleaming with anticipation, Margot forced her lips into the semblance of a smile. She'd learned to dissociate during these encounters, to send her mind far away, while her body endured whatever cruelties were inflicted upon it. Sometimes she imagined herself back in her father's shop, the warm smell of baking bread filling her nostrils. Other times, she pictured herself in the countryside, running through fields of wildflowers under an endless blue sky. But today, even her escape mechanisms failed her. The young lord's particular brand of sadism seemed especially creative, and by the time he finished with her, Margot lay curled on the straw mattress, blood seeping from new wounds. He tossed a few copper coins onto the floor beside her and left without a word, already planning his next visit. The coins lay there like tiny accusations, mocking symbols of what her body had become worth. She couldn't bring herself to pick them up, knowing that Madame Heloise would collect them anyway. Everything belonged to the Madame. Their bodies, their earnings, their very lives. As the day wore on, more customers came and went. A fat merchant who reeked of garlic and sweat. A young soldier who wept afterward and begged her forgiveness. An old man whose trembling hands left bruises on her arms. Each encounter blurred into the next, a nightmarish parade of human degradation. Between customers, Margot would catch glimpses of the other women. Isabel, who'd been there the longest, had developed a persistent cough that brought up flecks of blood. The madam refused to let her rest, claiming that a little blood never killed anyone. But Margot could see death creeping into the older woman's eyes, patient and inevitable. Young Petra had begun pulling out her own hair, leaving bald patches across her scalp. She would sit in corners, rocking back and forth and whispering prayers to a god who seemed to have abandoned them all. The madame had beaten her for the hair pulling, but it only made the girl more frantic, more desperate in her self-destruction. And then there was Agnes, who had simply stopped eating. She would stare at her meagre portions of bread and watery gruel as if they were poison, her body growing thinner each day. When Madame Eloise tried to force-feed her, Agnes would vomit it all back up, her body rejecting even the most basic sustenance. The brothel had become a gallery of human suffering, each woman trapped in her own private hell, while the world outside continued its indifferent rotation. Margot watched her fellow prisoners slowly disintegrate, knowing that she was following the same inevitable path. The person she had been, the baker's daughter with dreams and hopes, was dying a little more each day, replaced by this hollow shell that existed only to be used and discarded. Winter was approaching, and with it would come new hardships. The brothel was poorly heated, and many of the women would fall ill from the cold and damp. Some would not survive until spring. Margot had already noticed the telltale signs in herself, the persistent fatigue, the way wounds took longer to heal, the frequent dizzy spells that left her gripping whatever was nearby for support. But perhaps death would be a mercy. In her darkest moments, as she lay bleeding and broken after particularly brutal encounters, Margot found herself welcoming the thought of eternal rest. What was there left to live for? Her family believed her dead. Her virtue was long gone. Her body was failing. Her spirit was shattered. Yet something stubborn within her refused to surrender completely. Perhaps it was the memory of her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair, or the sound of her father's laughter echoing through their small home. Perhaps it was simply the animal instinct to survive, no matter how desperate the circumstances. Whatever it was, it kept her breathing, kept her moving through each hellish day. The other women felt it too, this refusal to be completely broken, In stolen moments between customers, they would share small kindnesses, a scrap of bread saved from their meager meals, a gentle touch to ease someone's pain, whispered words of comfort in the darkness. These tiny acts of humanity were rebellion against a system designed to strip them of everything that made them human. Lisette would sometimes hum lullabies to her unborn child, her hand resting protectively over her growing belly. The sound was hauntingly beautiful in the squalid surroundings, a reminder that life and hope could persist even in the darkest places. The other women would listen in silence, drawing what comfort they could from the melody. Agnes, despite her refusal to eat, would braid the younger girl's hair when the madame wasn't watching. Her gentle fingers would work through the tangles and dirt, creating moments of tenderness in a world defined by violence. It was a small thing, but in this place, small things became precious beyond measure. Even Marie, broken as she was, would sometimes reach out to comfort others when they cried. Her touch was ghost-like, barely there, but it carried the weight of shared suffering and understanding. No words were needed. The simple contact said everything about their common plight. These moments of connection became lifelines in an ocean of despair. They reminded the women that beneath the bruises and degradation, they were still human beings capable of compassion and love. It was the one thing Madame Heloise couldn't steal from them, no matter how cruel her punishments or how complete her control. But such moments were rare and always tinged with the knowledge that they could be interrupted at any second. The sound of footsteps on the stairs would send them scurrying back to their assigned positions, the brief respite shattered by the return of their nightmare reality. As night fell once again, bringing with it a fresh parade of customers seeking to satisfy their darkest urges, Margot prepared herself for another descent into hell. She had learned to measure time, not in days or weeks, but in survived encounters. Each one she lived through was a small victory, proof that some essential part of her remained unbroken. The candles guttered in their holders, casting dancing shadows on the walls like demons celebrating another successful day of human torment. Outside, the city continued its nightly activities, merchants closing their shops, families gathering for evening meals, children being tucked safely into warm beds. It was a world that seemed impossibly distant from the horrors contained within these walls. But Margot held on to the knowledge that it existed, that somewhere beyond this nightmare, people still lived normal lives filled with ordinary joys and sorrows. It was a fragile thread of hope, but it was hers, and she guarded it jealously against the forces that sought to destroy everything beautiful in the world. Tomorrow would bring new pain, new humiliation, new tests of her will to survive. But tonight, in the few precious hours before dawn, she would hold on to that thread and remember that she was more than what this place had made her. She was Margot, daughter of a baker, keeper of dreams, and survivor of horrors that would have broken lesser souls. The darkness pressed in around her, but somewhere in its depths, a tiny flame continued to burn. As you drift deeper into the haze of another sleepless night, your mind clouded with pain and desperation, let me tell you about the women who inhabited the darkest corners of medieval society. The women whose very existence was both necessary and reviled, whose bodies became currency in a world that offered them no other choice. Your name is Margot, and you are 23 years old, though you feel ancient beyond your years. The brothel that has become your prison sits in the shadow of the great cathedral, its bells tolling the hours of your captivity. Each chime reminds you of the prayers you once whispered as a child, before hunger and circumstance led you down this path from which there seems no return. The morning begins before dawn, as it always does. The madam, a woman whose own beauty was long ago carved away by this life, shakes you awake with calloused hands. Your body aches from the previous night's work. Bruises blooming like dark flowers across your ribs and thighs. There is no gentle awakening in this place, no moment of peace before the day's torments begin. You share a cramped room with 3 other women, each nursing their own wounds, both visible and hidden. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap perfume, and something else you cannot name but have learned to associate with despair. The straw mattresses are infested with fleas and lice, creatures that feast upon you as surely as the men who pay for your flesh. Water for washing is scarce and cold, drawn from a well that serves the entire quarter. You splash the icy liquid on your face and neck, trying to wash away the memory of hands that groped and grabbed in the darkness. The soap, if you can call it that, is little more than ash and animal fat, harsh against your already irritated skin. Your hair, once your pride, now hangs in greasy tangles that you try desperately to arrange into something presentable. The clothes you wear are not your own. Nothing in this place belongs to you, not even your body. The dress is a faded red, the color of dried blood, with a neckline cut scandalously low to advertise what lies beneath. The fabric is coarse and scratchy, mended so many times that the original weave is lost beneath layers of rough stitching. Your shoes, if they can be called that, are wooden clogs that chafe against your feet with every step. Breakfast, when it comes, is a thin gruel that tastes of nothing and everything wrong. Sometimes there is bread, hard and mouldy, that you gnaw on desperately because you never know when the next meal might come. The madam controls the food as she controls everything else, using hunger as another chain to bind you to this place. You have learned to eat quickly, to swallow without tasting, because the alternative is starvation. The other women around you tell their stories in whispered fragments. There is Elena, barely 16, sold by her own father to pay his gambling debts. Her eyes still hold traces of the shock that comes with such betrayal, though the light in them dims a little more each day. Beside her sits Catherine, who was once a merchant's wife until plague took her husband and left her destitute. She speaks little now, her voice worn away by screaming that no one heard. Then there is old Mary, though she is perhaps only 30. She has been here the longest, and her body tells the story of every year in scars and broken bones that never healed properly. She has become something of a mother to the younger girls, teaching them which customers to fear most, which ones might show a moment's kindness, and how to survive when survival seems impossible. The brothel itself is a maze of narrow corridors and small windowless rooms. The walls are thin, and you can hear everything that happens in the neighbouring chambers. The sounds that seep through the wood are not of pleasure, but of pain, fear, and resignation. Sometimes you hear weeping that goes on for hours. Sometimes you hear nothing at all, and that silence is somehow worse. Your first customer arrives before the sun has fully risen. He is a merchant, fat and sweating, who reeks of ale and onions. His hands are rough and dirty, his breath hot against your face as he pants and grunts above you. You have learned to detach your mind from your body during these encounters, to float somewhere above the scene and watch as if it were happening to someone else. But sometimes the pain is too sharp, too immediate to escape. Sometimes the customer is violent, taking pleasure not just in your body, but in your suffering. The madam warns you never to cry out, never to resist, because that only makes them pay less and hurt you more. So you bite your tongue until you taste blood and pray for it to end quickly. Between customers, you are expected to clean yourself as best you can with the limited water provided. There is no privacy for this, no dignity in any part of your existence. The other women move about in various states of undress, their bodies displaying the evidence of their trade in bruises, cuts, and worse. You have all learned to look without seeing, to exist in the same space while protecting what little remains of your souls. The men who visit are from every level of society. Merchants and labourers, soldiers and clergy, young men experiencing their first taste of purchased flesh, and old men seeking to recapture their fading vitality. They all share certain characteristics: the way they look through you rather than at you, the casual cruelty with which they use your body, the absolute certainty that you exist solely for their pleasure. Some try to convince themselves that you enjoy it, that you chose this life freely. They whisper sweet words they think you want to hear, as if their coins could purchase not just your body but your genuine affection. Others make no such pretense, taking what they want with mechanical efficiency before leaving without a word. You are not sure which is worse, the ones who pretend you are human or the ones who acknowledge that you are not. The madam collects the money, always the money, counting each coin with practiced fingers while you stand naked and shivering in the corner. She takes her cut, the largest portion, and gives you barely enough to survive. This, she explains, is the cost of your room and board, your protection, your very existence in this place. You are always in debt to her, always owing more than you can possibly earn, trapped in a web of financial servitude that ensures you can never leave. Food comes irregularly and is often spoiled or infested with insects. You learn to eat around the maggots, to swallow rotten meat because it is the only protein you will see for days. Your body grows thin and weak, your monthly bleeding stops, and strange rashes appear on your skin. There is no physician for women like you, no care for your health beyond ensuring you can still perform your duties. Disease is a constant spectre haunting the brothel. Some of the women develop mysterious sores that weep constantly. Others begin coughing blood or suffer from fevers that leave them delirious for days. The French disease, as some call it, spreads through the brothel like wildfire, leaving its victims scarred and eventually mad. You watch women you have come to care for waste away, their bodies betraying them in the most horrible ways, and you know that this could be your fate as well. The authorities, when they come, are not there to help. The City Watch occasionally raids the brothel, not out of moral concern, but to collect bribes and select women for their own use. The church condemns your existence while its priests slip through the back door under cover of darkness. The law considers you less than human, with no rights and no protections. If a customer kills you, it is barely worth investigating. You are property, and damaged property at that. Sleep, when it comes, is fitful and haunted. You dream of your childhood, of the small village where you were born, of the mother who died when you were 12 and left you vulnerable to the world's cruelties. You dream of the man who promised to marry you, who took your virginity and then disappeared with your family's savings. You dream of the choices that led you here, each one seeming reasonable at the time, each one closing another door until only this one remained open. But even in this hell, there are moments of unexpected humanity. Elena shares her meager bread with you when you are too sick to earn. Catherine teaches you how to make your face look less bruised with a mixture of ash and pig fat. Old Mary tells stories of her life before, painting pictures of a world where women had choices, had value beyond their bodies. These small kindnesses become lifelines, reminders that you are still human, despite everything that has been done to you. The seasons change outside the brothel's walls, but inside, every day is the same grey twilight of survival. You begin to lose track of time, of who you were before this place claimed you. Your reflection in the cracked mirror shows a stranger, hollow-eyed, gaunt, marked by violence and despair. Sometimes you wonder if you are already dead, if this is some kind of purgatory where souls work off their earthly sins through endless suffering. The worst part is not the physical pain, though that is considerable. It is not even the degradation, though that cuts deep. The worst part is the gradual erosion of hope, the slow realization that this might be all there is, that you might die in this place without ever again feeling the sun on your face or hearing your own laughter. The worst part is learning to accept it, to stop fighting, to become the thing they say you are. Yet still, in the darkest moments, some spark of defiance remains. When a customer is particularly cruel, when the madam withholds food for days, when another woman dies and is carried out like refuse, something inside you refuses to break completely. Perhaps it is the memory of your mother's voice, singing lullabies in the darkness. Perhaps it is the dream of a better world that must exist somewhere beyond these walls. Perhaps it is simply the stubborn refusal of the human spirit to surrender entirely to despair. And so you endure, one day at a time, one customer at a time, one small act of kindness from a fellow sufferer at a time. You survive because survival is all you have left, because somewhere in the depths of your soul, you still believe that you are more than what they have made you. You are Margot, and though your body has been sold, your spirit remains, battered but unbroken, waiting for dawn in a place where dawn never seems to come. In the medieval world, women like Margot existed in the shadows of society. Their lives a testament to the brutal realities of a time when survival often came at the cost of everything else. Their stories, largely unrecorded by history, speak to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. As you drift off to sleep, remember that even in the darkest places, humanity persists, love endures, and hope, however faint, continues to flicker in the darkness. Looking at your previous work and the reference materials, here's part 6 of your medieval brothel script. The nights were perhaps the cruelest hours of all. When the last patron stumbled out into the darkness and the brothel keeper finally locked the heavy wooden door, Margot would collapse onto her straw mattress, her body aching from the evening's brutal encounters. The silence that followed was both a blessing and a curse, for in those quiet moments, the memories she worked so desperately to suppress would come flooding back like water through a broken dam. She would remember her mother's face, worn and weathered from years of backbreaking labour in the fields. She would recall the small cottage where she had spent her childhood, with its dirt floor and thatched roof that leaked when the rains came heavy. Those had been hard times, certainly, but they were times when she still belonged to herself, when her body was her own and her future, however uncertain, was hers to shape. The path that led her to this place had been paved with desperation and impossible choices. When the harvest failed 3 summers running and her father took ill with a fever that would not break, the family had faced a stark reality. There was no money for food, no coin for medicine, and winter was approaching with the inevitability of death itself. The local Lord Steward had come collecting taxes with armed men at his back, and when her father could not pay, they had seized what little the family possessed. It was then that the brothel keeper had appeared, a woman whose painted face could not quite hide the hardness in her eyes. She spoke in honeyed tones of opportunity, of a chance for a young woman to earn enough coin to save her family from starvation. The work, she claimed, was not so different from what wives did for their husbands, except that here, a woman could be compensated for her efforts. The promises were wrapped in silk, but the reality, as Margot had learned all too quickly, was fashioned from iron and thorns. The other women in the brothel each carried their own stories of how they had arrived at this wretched place. There was Elena, barely 16, who had been sold by her own uncle when her parents died of the sweating sickness. Her eyes held a vacant quality, as if her soul had retreated so far inward that it might never find its way back to the surface. She spoke little, moving through her days like a ghost haunting the scenes of her own destruction. Then there was Beatrice, older and more hardened, who had once been a merchant's wife before her husband's debts had consumed everything they owned. She had tried to maintain some dignity in those early days, speaking of her former life with a pride that gradually eroded under the weight of countless humiliations. Now she laughed too loudly at the crude jokes of their patrons and drank herself into oblivion whenever she could afford the ale. Agnes was perhaps the most tragic of all, for she had come to this place willingly, believing herself in love with a young man who had promised to marry her once he had earned enough coin through trading. She had given herself to him freely, only to discover that he had been selling her favors to other men all along. When she confronted him, he had beaten her senseless and sold her outright to the brothel keeper. She still spoke his name sometimes in her sleep, and Margot wondered if she dreamed of killing him or of winning him back. The women formed an unlikely sisterhood, bound together by their shared degradation and their mutual understanding of what it meant to survive in a world that saw them as nothing more than vessels for men's desires. They shared what little food they could hide from the brothel keeper's grasping hands, tended each other's wounds when the patrons grew too rough, and offered what comfort they could when the weight of their existence became too much to bear alone. On the worst nights, when a patron had been particularly violent, or when disease threatened to spread through their ranks like wildfire, they would huddle together and whisper stories of escape. They spoke of distant cities where women could disappear and start anew, of convents that might accept even fallen women seeking redemption, of wealthy merchants who might take a woman as a mistress and treat her with some measure of kindness. But these were fairy tales told in the darkness, stories meant to ease the passage into sleep, rather than plans that could ever see the light of day. The reality was that they were trapped as surely as if they wore shackles of iron. The brothel keeper watched them constantly, and her network of informants throughout the city meant that any woman who tried to flee would be quickly returned. The few who had attempted escape and been caught served as grim reminders to the others, their faces bearing the permanent marks of their punishment. The church, which might have offered sanctuary to other desperate souls, held no refuge for women like them. The priests who sometimes visited the brothel spoke of sin and damnation, but their presence there suggested a hypocrisy that made their words ring hollow. Society had declared them irredeemably fallen, and there was no path back to respectability once a woman had been branded with the mark of the whore. The legal system offered no protection either. A woman in a brothel had no standing to bring charges against those who wronged her, no right to testify in court, no claim to justice under the law. They existed in a shadow realm, neither fully human nor entirely expendable, useful only so long as their bodies could generate coin for those who owned them. Disease was a constant spectre haunting their lives. The French pox, as it was called, could render a woman hideous and mad before killing her slowly and painfully. Other ailments spread through intimate contact, leaving women bleeding and fevered, unable to work but still expected to service whatever patrons could stomach their condition. The brothel keeper showed no mercy to the sick, for a diseased woman was a liability that threatened the health of the others and the profits of the establishment. When winter came, the cold seeped through the thin walls of their quarters, and many of the women developed terrible coughs that racked their bodies and left them spitting blood into rags. Food became even scarcer, and the brothel keeper would reduce their already meager rations, claiming that the business was slow and every coin had to be carefully managed. Some of the weaker women did not survive these harsh months, their bodies finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of malnutrition, disease, and despair. The death of a sister was mourned in secret, for the brothel keeper saw grief as a luxury that interfered with productivity. The dead woman's few possessions would be distributed among the survivors, and her space would be filled within days by some new unfortunate soul caught in circumstances beyond her control. It was as if she had never existed at all, except in the memories of those who had shared her suffering. Yet even in this place of darkness, moments of unexpected humanity would sometimes break through like sunlight piercing storm clouds. A patron might show unexpected gentleness, speaking kindly or leaving an extra coin without being asked. One of the women might share a cherished memory from her former life, reminding the others that they had once been daughters and sisters, beloved by someone who saw them as more than mere flesh for sale. These moments were precious beyond measure, for they reminded the women that beneath the painted faces and practiced smiles, their essential humanity endured. They were more than the sum of the violence done to them, more than the degradation they were forced to endure, more than the despair that threatened to consume them entirely. Margot clung to these fragments of light with desperate intensity, for she understood that to surrender them would be to lose herself completely. In the darkest hours before dawn, when the brothel was silent and still, she would close her eyes and remember the sound of her mother's voice singing while she worked, the feeling of sun on her face as she walked through fields of grain, the taste of fresh bread on feast days when the harvest had been good. These memories were all she had left of the person she had once been, and she guarded them fiercely against the forces that sought to strip away every last vestige of her former self. They were the ember of hope that refused to be extinguished, the proof that somewhere beneath the layers of pain and humiliation, Margot endured. In the brothel's twisted hierarchy, survival often depended on one's ability to navigate the complex web of alliances and enmities that developed among both the women and their keepers. The brothel keeper herself was a woman of middle years who had once walked the same path as those she now controlled. Her rise to power had come through a combination of cunning, ruthlessness, and the favor of wealthy patrons who found her services indispensable. She ruled her domain with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove, maintaining order through a careful balance of rewards and punishments. Those who pleased her might receive better food, finer clothes, or protection from the most violent customers. Those who crossed her faced beatings, starvation, or worse. She had perfected the art of breaking a woman's spirit without damaging her body too severely, for damaged goods brought lower prices in the marketplace of flesh. The establishment operated under the tacit approval of local authorities, who collected their bribes with the same regularity that the church collected its tithes. The city watch would occasionally make a show of raiding the brothel, but these were carefully orchestrated performances designed to appease public morality while changing nothing of substance. The same men who participated in these raids were often regular customers, creating a web of complicity that ensured the system's continuation. As evening settles over the medieval village and shadows lengthen across the cobblestone streets, we find ourselves in the 7th chapter of our harrowing journey through the brutal existence of a brothel woman in these unforgiving times. The weight of accumulated suffering has begun to take its toll, not just on bodies already weakened by disease and malnutrition, but on the very souls of these forgotten women. By now, the endless cycle of degradation has worn deep grooves in the psyche of every woman trapped within these walls. The initial shock of their circumstances has given way to something far more insidious, a creeping numbness that threatens to extinguish whatever spark of humanity remains. For Margot and her sisters in suffering, survival has become an exercise in dissociation, a daily practice of separating mind from body, spirit from flesh. The brothel keeper, Henri, has perfected his system of control through a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological manipulation. He understands that broken spirits are more profitable than rebellious ones. Each morning brings new humiliations designed not just to service clients, but to reinforce the women's sense of worthlessness. They are lined up like livestock for inspection, their bodies examined for signs of disease or pregnancy that might interfere with business. Those found wanting face immediate punishment, reduced rations, increased client loads, or worse. The hierarchy among the women has become more pronounced as desperation sets in. Newer arrivals, still clinging to hope or defiance, find themselves at the bottom of an already hellish pecking order. The more experienced women, hollowed out by years of abuse, have learned to navigate the system with cold calculation. They hoard scraps of food, compete for the less violent clients, and sometimes turn on each other in their desperation to survive just one more day. Winter's approach brings fresh terrors to an already nightmarish existence. The brothel's inadequate heating means the women huddle together for warmth, their breath visible in the frigid air. Clients become more aggressive, as if the season's darkness gives them license to unleash their worst impulses. The lack of fresh food means scurvy and other diseases spread rapidly through the cramped quarters, leaving the women's bodies even more vulnerable to the constant assault they endure. Medical care, what little exists, is reserved for those who can still generate profit. A woman too sick to service clients becomes a liability to be discarded. Margot has watched friends disappear into the night, their bodies too broken to continue, their fates sealed by Henri's cold arithmetic. The local physician, when he bothers to visit at all, treats the women like diseased animals, showing neither compassion nor professional interest in their well-being. The psychological torment extends beyond the brothel's walls. These women have become pariahs in their own community, shunned by former neighbors and family members who view them as contaminated beyond redemption. The church, which should offer sanctuary and forgiveness, instead preaches that they are vessels of sin, deserving of their fate. Even sympathetic souls dare not show kindness publicly, lest they be associated with such fallen women. Sleep, when it comes, offers no respite. Nightmares plague their rest, replaying the day's horrors or conjuring even worse scenarios. Some women have developed a 1,000-yard stare, their minds retreating so far from reality that they function like automatons, going through the motions of existence while their consciousness floats somewhere beyond reach of pain. The bonds between the women have evolved into something both beautiful and tragic. In quiet moments between clients, they share whispered stories of their former lives, creating a collective memory of who they once were. They tend each other's wounds with torn scraps of cloth, share precious drops of clean water, and sometimes simply hold each other while tears fall silently in the darkness. These moments of tenderness are acts of rebellion against a system designed to strip away their humanity. Food has become both sustenance and weapon in Henri's arsenal of control. Meals are deliberately inadequate: thin gruel, mouldy bread, and water that tastes of sewage. Women who please clients might receive an extra crust. Those who resist face days without food. The constant hunger weakens their bodies, but also their will to fight. Some have resorted to eating scraps left by clients or begging kitchen staff for table scraps, further eroding their dignity. The seasonal changes mark time's passage in this place, where days blend into an endless nightmare. Summer brought stifling heat and the stench of unwashed bodies in close quarters, while autumn's chill reminded them of the harsh winter ahead. Each season brings its own particular miseries: summer's disease outbreaks, winter's cold and hunger, spring's false promises of renewal that never come for women in their position. Personal hygiene has become impossible to maintain. The brothel provides no facilities for proper washing, and clean clothing is a luxury reserved for special occasions when appearances matter for business. The women's hair becomes matted and dirty, their skin marked by bruises, cuts, and the inevitable signs of malnutrition. They begin to smell of desperation and decay, a scent that clings to them like a shroud. Yet even in this abyss of human suffering, small acts of defiance persist. A woman might hide a coin to buy bread for a sick friend. Another might deliberately displease a particularly cruel client, accepting punishment to deny him satisfaction. These tiny rebellions cost them dearly, but preserve some fragment of their self-respect, proving that the human spirit can endure even under the most crushing circumstances. The arrival of new women has become a source of both hope and despair for the veterans. Fresh faces remind them of who they once were, stirring painful memories of innocence lost. But they also know these newcomers will soon join their ranks of the broken, adding to the weight of collective suffering that presses down on all who dwell in this house of horrors. As winter deepens and the 7th month of our tale draws to a close, the women find themselves changed in ways that run deeper than physical scars. They have learned to endure the unendurable, to find meaning in meaninglessness, and to clutch at fragments of hope in the depths of despair. Their story continues, a testament to both human cruelty and the inexplicable resilience of the human spirit, even when that spirit has been battered nearly beyond recognition. Here's part 8 of the 12-part script for your brutal life as a brothel woman in medieval times. The endless cycle of degradation had worn away at more than just your body. It had carved deep wounds into your very soul, leaving scars that would never fully heal. Each day brought fresh humiliations, new ways for your humanity to be stripped away piece by piece, until you sometimes wondered if anything of your true self remained beneath the layers of pain and shame. The other women understood this erosion of spirit all too well. You could see it in their eyes during the rare quiet moments when guards weren't watching, when clients weren't demanding, when Madame Heloise wasn't scheming new ways to extract profit from your suffering. There was a hollowness there, a kind of living death that had settled over all of you like a shroud. But even in this place where hope seemed impossible, where every dawn brought only the promise of more abuse, something remarkable persisted. In the smallest gestures, in whispered conversations conducted in darkness, in the way hands found each other during moments of shared anguish, fragments of your humanity endured. Marie, despite her own constant torment, would sometimes save a crust of bread when food was scarce, pressing it into the hands of whoever seemed weakest that day. Agnes, whose spirit had been so thoroughly broken by years of violence, still found ways to offer comfort with a gentle touch or a soft word when the nightmares came. Even Isabel, hardened by survival and suspicious of everyone, would position herself between the younger girls and the most violent clients when she could manage it without drawing attention. These acts of kindness were dangerous. They risked punishment if discovered, and they required energy that none of you could spare. Yet they happened anyway, small rebellions against a system designed to strip away every trace of compassion and connection. In a world that treated you as less than human, you stubbornly insisted on treating each other as something more. The nights were often the worst times, when the establishment hummed with activity and your bodies were put to use in ways that left you feeling disconnected from yourself. But sometimes, in the deepest hours before dawn, when the last client had stumbled away and exhaustion finally granted a brief respite, you would find yourselves huddled together in whatever corner offered the most shelter from prying eyes. In these stolen moments, voices would emerge from the darkness. Someone might hum a half-remembered lullaby from childhood, the melody floating through the stale air like a ghost of innocence lost. Another might whisper fragments of prayers learned long ago, before life had taught her that God either didn't exist or didn't care about girls like you. Sometimes there were stories, carefully edited tales of life before this place. Memories polished smooth by countless retellings until only the beautiful parts remained. These gatherings were never planned and never acknowledged in daylight. They simply happened, drawn together by a need deeper than hunger or thirst. The need to remember that you had once been children with dreams, that you had mothers who sang to you, that you had believed the world held possibilities beyond this endless nightmare. Henri despised these moments of connection when he discovered them. He understood, perhaps better than Madame Heloise, that solidarity among his victims posed a threat to his control. Isolated women were easier to manipulate, easier to break, easier to mold into the compliant tools he required. So he worked constantly to undermine any bonds that formed, setting you against each other with promises of better treatment, extra food, or protection from the worst clients. Sometimes his tactics worked. Desperation could make anyone betray a friend for the promise of one night's peace. But more often than you might expect, the bonds held. When Claudette was caught stealing bread and faced a brutal beating, the rest of you found ways to share your own meager rations so she could recover her strength. When young Marguerite first arrived, terrified and crying for her mother, it was the collective warmth of the other women that helped her survive those first horrible weeks. The church, which should have offered comfort and sanctuary, instead served as another source of torment. Priests would occasionally visit the establishment, ostensibly to offer spiritual guidance, but often seeking the same services as any other client. Their hypocrisy was particularly cruel, preaching about sin and redemption while participating in your exploitation. You learned to navigate their visits with the same careful attention you gave to any dangerous client. Some genuinely seemed to believe they were saving your souls, even as they violated your bodies. Others dispensed harsh judgments about your moral failings while conveniently ignoring their own. A few used their religious authority to demand even more degrading acts, claiming it was God's will that you submit to their desires. The contradiction was maddening. You were simultaneously told that your suffering was punishment for your sins, and that your very existence was an affront to divine order. There was no path to redemption offered, no genuine hope for forgiveness or escape. You were trapped in a theological prison as confining as the physical walls that held you. Yet even here, in the face of such spiritual cruelty, some of you found ways to maintain a connection to something greater than your circumstances. Perhaps it wasn't the God of the priests who visited your beds, but something quieter, more personal. A presence felt in the moments when pain became so intense it transcended the physical, when suffering reached a point where it almost became sacred. This wasn't the organized religion of grand cathedrals and wealthy clergy, but something more primitive and immediate. It lived in the way you held each other during the worst moments, in the fierce protectiveness that emerged when one of your sisters was threatened, in the stubborn refusal to let your captors destroy every trace of love and compassion. The seasons changed outside your prison, marking the passage of time in ways that the endless repetition of your days made difficult to track. Spring would bring news of festivals and celebrations in the world beyond. Summer carried the sounds of harvest and prosperity. Autumn whispered of preparation and gathering. And winter wrapped the world in the kind of silence that made your isolation feel even more complete. You began to measure time differently than other people. Not in days or weeks, but in the spaces between cruelties. The brief calm after a violent client left. The temporary respite when illness kept you confined to your bed. The precious minutes when distraction allowed your mind to wander to memories of freedom. Some women counted their survival in years, marking anniversaries of their arrival with grim determination. Others refused to acknowledge the passage of time at all, living entirely in the present moment because the past was too painful and the future too hopeless to contemplate. A few created elaborate fantasies about escape, spinning detailed stories about the lives they would build if they ever found freedom. These coping mechanisms weren't signs of madness, though madness certainly claimed some victims. They were evidence of the mind's remarkable ability to adapt, to find ways of preserving essential humanity even under the most dehumanizing conditions. You learned to dissociate during the worst abuse, to send your consciousness somewhere else while your body endured what it must. You developed complex internal worlds where you could retreat when external reality became unbearable. The establishment's routines became as fixed and predictable as the movement of stars. Morning brought the harsh awakening to another day of survival. Afternoon meant preparation for the evening's clients, the careful application of whatever cosmetics were available to hide the evidence of your suffering. Evening brought the parade of men seeking to purchase pieces of your soul along with your body. Night was when the real work happened, when you performed the acts that kept you alive while slowly killing you inside. But within these rigid patterns, you found tiny spaces for rebellion. A moment of eye contact that conveyed genuine recognition of another's humanity. A deliberately clumsy movement that accidentally denied a client some small pleasure. The careful hoarding of information that might someday prove useful. These acts of resistance were nearly invisible, but they mattered because they proved to yourself that some part of you remained unconquered. The other women in your situation became more than companions in suffering. They became family in the truest sense, bound together by shared trauma and mutual survival. You learned each other's stories gradually, in fragments shared during quiet moments. Maria had been sold by her own father to pay gambling debts. Catherine had been promised work as a seamstress and discovered the truth too late. Elena had been widowed young and had no other options when her husband's debts came due. Each story was unique in its details, but heartbreakingly similar in its trajectory. All of you had been failed by the systems that should have protected you. All of you had been reduced to commodities in a transaction that valued profit over human dignity. All of you were trying to find ways to endure that didn't require surrendering every trace of who you had once been. As this existence continued, wearing away at your spirit day by day, you discovered reserves of strength you never knew you possessed. Not the kind of strength that could break down doors or overpower your captors, but something more subtle and perhaps more powerful. The strength to comfort others when you yourself were broken. The strength to maintain hope when hope seemed foolish. The strength to love and be loved, even in a place designed to destroy such connections. This was your reality now. This brutal life that ground on with relentless cruelty. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, and the day after that, and all the days stretching ahead into an uncertain future. But tonight in the darkness, you were not entirely alone. Tonight, there were other hearts beating nearby, other souls fighting the same battle for survival and dignity. Tonight, that had to be enough. Here's part 9 of the YouTube script, Your Brutal Life as a Brothel Woman in Medieval Times. But the physical and psychological torment of brothel life was only one aspect of Margot's suffering. The very walls that contained her were themselves instruments of oppression, designed to extract every ounce of profit from human misery while offering nothing in return but degradation and despair. The brothel operated as a carefully orchestrated machine of exploitation, with every detail calculated to maximize revenue while minimizing the humanity of those trapped within its confines. From the moment a woman entered these establishments, she was systematically stripped of her identity, her dignity, and any hope of escape. The madams who ran these houses were often former prostitutes themselves, having clawed their way to positions of relative power through years of cunning manipulation and ruthless self-preservation. They understood the business intimately because they had once been its victims, and this knowledge made them particularly effective at breaking down the resistance of new arrivals. These women had learned that compassion was a luxury they could not afford, that survival meant becoming as hard and calculating as the men who profited from their establishments. They wore their cruelty like armor, protecting themselves from the guilt that might otherwise consume them by convincing themselves that they were simply conducting business. That sentiment had no place in the harsh realities of their world. When a new woman arrived at the brothel, whether sold by desperate family members, captured by traffickers, or driven by starvation to what seemed like her only option, she would be subjected to a deliberate process of dehumanization that began immediately upon her arrival. The transformation started with her appearance. Her hair would be styled according to the house's preferences, often in elaborate arrangements that marked her as property of that particular establishment. Cosmetics would be applied heavily, creating a mask that obscured her natural features and transformed her into a commodity designed to appeal to male fantasies. The clothing she was given served dual purposes, simultaneously advertising her availability while ensuring she could never blend into respectable society should she attempt to escape. But the physical transformation was merely the beginning. Far more insidious was the psychological conditioning that followed, a systematic breaking down of her sense of self that would make resistance seem futile and compliance appear to be her only path to survival. The madams were skilled practitioners of psychological manipulation, understanding exactly how to exploit the vulnerabilities of women who had already been traumatized by the circumstances that led them to the brothel. They would alternate between small kindnesses and sudden cruelties, creating a state of emotional dependency that made their victims desperate for any scrap of approval or affection. A warm meal or a kind word would be offered just when despair seemed overwhelming, creating a false sense of gratitude that the madams would then exploit to extract compliance. This psychological warfare was perhaps more damaging than the physical abuse, as it attacked the very core of a woman's sense of reality and self-worth. The daily routine of the brothel was designed to eliminate any sense of personal agency or control. Women were told when to wake, when to eat, when to bathe, and when to receive clients. Their time was not their own, every moment allocated according to the demands of the business. Even their most intimate bodily functions were subject to scrutiny and regulation, as the madams maintained strict control over every aspect of their existence. The clients themselves represented every stratum of medieval society, from wealthy merchants seeking exotic pleasures to common laborers spending their meager wages on a few moments of imagined intimacy. Each brought their own particular brand of violence and degradation, their own twisted fantasies that the women were expected to fulfill without question or complaint. Some clients preferred the illusion of romance, demanding that the women pretend to enjoy their attentions and express false affection. Others made no pretense of seeking anything beyond domination and control, viewing the women as objects to be used and discarded without thought for their humanity. The wealthy clients were often the most dangerous, as their money bought them not just access, but impunity. They could demand anything they desired, knowing that the madams would never risk losing such lucrative customers by protecting the women under their control. These men often had specific tastes for violence or degradation, and the women had no choice but to submit to whatever torments they devised. The psychological impact of being forced to smile and express gratitude while being brutalized was devastating, creating a dissociation from reality that many women never fully recovered from. The economic structure of the brothel ensured that escape remained virtually impossible. Every woman was kept in a state of artificial debt that grew larger with each passing day, regardless of how many clients she serviced or how much money she generated for the house. She was charged for her food, her lodging, her clothing, her cosmetics, and even the washing of her sheets. Medical care, when it was provided at all, came with exorbitant fees that were added to her debt. Fines were imposed for any perceived infractions, from speaking out of turn to failing to satisfy a client's demands. The mathematics of this system were deliberately impossible. No matter how hard a woman worked or how much she endured, the debt would continue to grow, creating a prison more secure than any physical walls. The madams would periodically review these debts with their victims, explaining in patronizing tones how much money was still owed and how many more years of service would be required to pay it off. They would express false sympathy for the woman's situation, while making it clear that any attempt to leave before the debt was satisfied would result in severe consequences. For women like Margot, who had been sold into this life as children, the debt represented not just their own supposed obligations, but also the money paid to acquire them in the first place. They were told that their families had received payment for them, creating a sense of guilt and obligation that made resistance feel like a betrayal of those they loved. This psychological manipulation was particularly effective with young women who had been raised to believe that obedience and self-sacrifice were their highest virtues. The isolation imposed by brothel life was another crucial element of control. Women were forbidden from maintaining contact with their families or former friends, and any relationships they formed within the brothel were subject to constant scrutiny and manipulation. The madams understood that solidarity among the women posed a threat to their control, so they worked systematically to create divisions and mistrust. They would play favorites, offering small privileges to some while punishing others, creating an atmosphere of competition and suspicion that prevented the formation of genuine bonds. Yet despite these efforts, connections did form. In the darkest moments of their existence, women like Margot found ways to offer each other small comforts and acts of kindness that helped preserve their humanity. They would share food when someone was being punished with hunger, offer whispered words of comfort after particularly brutal encounters with clients, or simply provide the silent companionship of shared suffering. These relationships, fragile as they were, represented the one aspect of their lives that the madams could not completely control. The health consequences of brothel life were catastrophic and deliberately ignored by those who profited from the women's suffering. Sexually transmitted diseases spread rapidly through these establishments, and the medical care provided was minimal and often ineffective. Women suffering from syphilis, gonorrhea, or other infections were expected to continue working until they became too ill to function, at which point they would be discarded like broken tools. Pregnancy was another constant threat, and the methods used to prevent or terminate pregnancies were primitive and dangerous. Many women died from botched procedures or infections, their deaths treated as unfortunate but acceptable losses in the pursuit of profit. Those who survived often suffered permanent damage that left them in chronic pain or unable to bear children in the future. The psychological toll of this existence was immeasurable. Many women developed what we would now recognize as severe mental illness, becoming withdrawn and unresponsive or exhibiting erratic and self-destructive behaviors. The constant trauma created a state of dissociation that allowed them to survive each day, but left them feeling disconnected from their own bodies and emotions. Some retreated so far into themselves that they seemed to disappear entirely, becoming hollow shells that performed their duties mechanically while their spirits withered away. Despite the overwhelming nature of their circumstances, some women found ways to maintain fragments of their former selves. They might secretly practice religious rituals learned in childhood, finding solace in prayer even when hope seemed absent. Others would compose songs or poems in their minds, creating inner worlds where beauty and meaning could still exist. These small acts of resistance were crucial for psychological survival, representing the refusal to surrender completely to the dehumanization that surrounded them. The broader society that allowed these institutions to flourish bore collective responsibility for the suffering they contained. The legal system provided no protection for the women trapped within brothels, treating them as criminals rather than victims. Religious authorities condemned them as sinners while ignoring the systemic forces that had driven them to such desperate circumstances. The economic elite who patronized these establishments were never held accountable for their role in perpetuating human trafficking and sexual slavery. Yet within this darkness, the human spirit proved remarkably resilient. Women like Margot, despite enduring unimaginable suffering, found ways to preserve their essential humanity through small acts of defiance and connection. They remembered their names even when forced to answer to others. They maintained their capacity for love and compassion, even when surrounded by cruelty. They held on to hope, even when it seemed foolish to do so. These acts of spiritual survival represent some of the most profound examples of human courage in the face of systematic oppression, reminding us that even in the darkest circumstances, the fundamental dignity of human beings cannot be entirely extinguished. Based on the script summary and reference materials, here's part 10 of the script. The seasons passed like a slow, grinding wheel for Margot and her fellow women. each bringing its own particular torments and fleeting respites. Winter was perhaps the cruelest time in the brothel, when the cold seeped through the rotting wooden walls and the thin, threadbare blankets provided little warmth against the bitter nights. The women huddled together in their cramped quarters, their breath visible in the frigid air, their bodies trembling, not just from the cold, but from the constant fear that stalked their every waking moment. During these dark months, food became even scarcer than usual. The brothel keeper, already notorious for her miserly ways, reduced their meagre rations to little more than scraps of mouldy bread and thin, watery gruel that barely qualified as sustenance. The women's bodies, already weakened by malnutrition and disease, grew gaunt and hollow-eyed. Their skin took on a sickly pallor that no amount of rouge could disguise, and their hair became brittle and lifeless, falling out in clumps that they would desperately try to hide. Margot watched as some of the newer girls, those who had arrived with still some spark of hope in their eyes, slowly succumbed to the relentless despair. She had seen it countless times before, the gradual dimming of the light within them, the way their shoulders would slump in defeat, the manner in which their voices would grow quiet and hollow. It was a transformation that broke her heart anew each time she witnessed it, yet she felt powerless to prevent it. The winter nights stretched endlessly, filled with the sounds of suffering that echoed through the thin walls. Coughing fits racked the women's bodies as consumption spread through their ranks like wildfire. The madame showed no mercy for the sick, forcing them to continue working even as they struggled to breathe, even as blood stained their lips and their bodies burned with fever. Those who collapsed were dragged to a dark corner and left to either recover or die, whichever came first. Margot had learned to recognize the signs of impending death in her companions, the way their eyes would lose focus, staring at something beyond the squalid walls of their prison. The manner in which their breathing would become shallow and labored, each breath a monumental effort. The gradual cooling of their skin as life slowly ebbed away. She had held too many dying hands, whispered too many final prayers for women whose names she barely knew, but whose suffering she shared. Yet even in the depths of winter's cruelty, the women found small ways to resist, to maintain some shred of their humanity. They would share their meager portions of food with those who were sicker, sacrificing their own desperate hunger for the sake of another. They would tell stories in hushed whispers during the brief moments when they were left alone, tales of their lives before this nightmare, dreams of escape, memories of families they might never see again. Margot became something of a keeper of these stories, collecting them like precious treasures in her mind. There was Agnes, barely 16, who had been sold by her own father to pay his gambling debts. She would speak of her mother's garden, of the roses that bloomed each spring, of the way the morning sun would filter through the kitchen window as they kneaded bread together. There was Catherine, older and more hardened, who had once been a merchant's wife until scandal and poverty had driven her to this place. She remembered the feel of silk against her skin, the weight of gold jewelry, the respect she had once commanded in society. These fragments of former lives served as both comfort and torment. They reminded the women that they had once been more than this, that they had once had names that meant something, lives that mattered. But they also highlighted the vast chasm between what they had been and what they had become, the irreversible nature of their fall from grace. Spring brought its own particular challenges. As the weather warmed and trade routes reopened, the brothel saw an influx of travelers, merchants, and soldiers. The demand for the women's services increased dramatically, meaning longer hours, more clients, and even less time to rest or recover. The madam, sensing opportunity, would often drug the women with wine laced with herbs to make them more compliant, more willing to endure the increasingly depraved demands of their customers. The warming weather also brought disease. The cramped, unsanitary conditions of the brothel became breeding grounds for pestilence. Fleas and lice multiplied rapidly, carrying sickness from person to person with ruthless efficiency. Dysentery swept through the building, leaving the women weak and dehydrated. Those who showed signs of the more visible diseases, the telltale sores of the French pox, the yellowing skin of liver ailments, were beaten savagely by the madam, as if violence could somehow cure what commerce had wrought. Margot's own body bore the accumulated damage of years in this hellish place. Her once clear skin was marked with scars and bruises in various stages of healing. Her hands, once soft and gentle, had become rough and calloused from the harsh soap she used to try to wash away the stench of her customers. Her teeth had begun to loosen from poor nutrition, and she had learned to smile carefully to hide the gaps where some had already fallen out. But perhaps the most devastating changes were those that couldn't be seen. The constant state of fear and hypervigilance had altered something fundamental in her mind. She startled at sudden sounds, flinched away from unexpected touch, and found herself unable to trust even the kindest gestures. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and filled with nightmares that blurred the line between her waking torment and the horrors her mind conjured in darkness. The summer months brought sweltering heat that made the already stifling air of the brothel nearly unbearable. The stench of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and human waste became so overwhelming that even the customers complained. The wooden building seemed to trap the heat like an oven, and the women would lie gasping in their quarters, too exhausted to move, their skin slick with sweat and grime. Water became a precious commodity, carefully rationed by the madam, who saw no profit in the women's comfort. They were allowed brief moments to wash themselves in dirty, lukewarm water that had already been used by multiple others. The luxury of a proper bath was reserved only for those occasions when a wealthy client specifically requested it, and even then, the women were rushed through the process and expected to make themselves available immediately afterward. During these scorching days, Margot would sometimes catch herself staring longingly at the small barred window in their quarters, watching as free people passed by on the street below. She would see women her own age, walking arm in arm with friends, their faces bright with laughter, their clothes clean and modest. She would watch children playing in the dust, their joy infectious even from a distance. These glimpses of normal life felt like looking into another world, one that existed parallel to her own, but might as well have been on the moon for all the chance she had of reaching it. The autumn brought its own rhythm of despair. As the harvest season arrived, the brothel would see an influx of rural workers and farmers with coins in their pockets and hunger in their eyes. These men, rough from months of hard labour, often proved to be among the most brutal customers. They came seeking release not just from physical desire, but from the grinding poverty and hopelessness of their own lives, and they took out their frustrations on the women who had no choice but to endure it. Margot learned to read the signs of different types of men to prepare herself mentally for what each might demand. The merchants who wanted to feel powerful and important, who would pay extra to humiliate and degrade. The soldiers who sought to recreate the violence they had witnessed or perpetrated on distant battlefields. The clergy who came in secret, their guilt and shame twisted into cruelty as they punished the women for their own moral failings. But it was during one particularly harsh autumn that Margot witnessed something that would haunt her for the rest of her days. A new girl had arrived, barely more than a child, with the same terrified innocence that Margot remembered feeling so long ago. The girl's name was Rose, and she had been brought by her own uncle, who claimed she was his ward, but whose cruel smile suggested a different relationship entirely. Rose's first night was a horror that even the hardened women found difficult to witness. Her screams echoed through the building as customer after customer took their turn, each one more violent than the last as they fed off her terror and pain. Margot tried to comfort her afterward, to offer what little solace she could, but Rose had retreated into herself so completely that she seemed almost catatonic. Within a week, Rose was dead. Whether by her own hand or from the injuries inflicted upon her, no one could say for certain. The Madame disposed of her body with the same casual indifference she showed for spoiled meat, tossing her into an unmarked grave outside the town walls where the other unwanted dead were buried. No prayers were said, no tears were officially shed, no record was kept of her brief, brutal existence. But Margot remembered. She added Rose's story to the collection she kept in her heart. Another name to whisper in the darkness. Another soul to honor with whatever dignity she could muster. The girl's death served as a stark reminder of how expendable they all were, how easily they could be snuffed out and forgotten, their lives reduced to nothing more than an inconvenient mess to be cleaned up. As the years blended together in an endless cycle of abuse and degradation, Margot began to notice changes in herself that went beyond the physical. She found herself becoming increasingly detached from her own body, as if she were watching her suffering from a distance. This dissociation was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed her to endure experiences that might otherwise have driven her completely mad, but it also meant that she felt increasingly disconnected from any sense of herself as a real person. The other women had developed their own coping mechanisms. Some turned to drink whenever they could get it, drowning their sorrows in whatever alcohol they could beg, steal, or earn. Others found solace in religion, clinging to the belief that their suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. Still others simply went through the motions of existence, their minds retreating to safer places while their bodies endured what they must. Yet despite everything, the violence, the disease, the degradation, the hopelessness, something within Margot refused to be completely extinguished. Perhaps it was the memory of her mother's love, or the echo of her father's voice reading to her by the fireside. Perhaps it was simply the stubborn core of humanity that no amount of cruelty could completely destroy. Whatever it was, it kept her going when others might have given up entirely. This ember of resistance manifested in small ways. She would sometimes hum lullabies under her breath while working, the melodies from her childhood providing a fragile link to who she had once been. She would share her food with the sickest women, even when she was starving herself. She would hold the hands of the dying, ensuring that no one passed from this world completely alone and unmourned. These acts of kindness were dangerous. The Madam viewed any display of compassion or solidarity among the women as a threat to her control. She would punish such behavior with beatings, starvation, or isolation in the cellar where previous girls had carved their names and final messages into the moldy walls. But Margot continued anyway, driven by something deeper than fear, some fundamental need to remain human in the face of dehumanizing circumstances. The cycle of seasons continued, each one bringing its own particular forms of suffering, its own small moments of grace. Through it all, Margot endured, survived, and somehow managed to keep alive the flickering flame of hope that one day, somehow, this nightmare might end. Here's part 11 of the 12-part script for Your Brutal Life as a Brothel Woman in Medieval Times. As winter's grip tightened around the brothel walls, you found yourself trapped in an existence that had become a grotesque parody of survival. The coin that once seemed so vital now felt like blood money burning through your fingers, never enough to secure the freedom that dangled like a cruel mirage just beyond reach. Each transaction with a client was another step deeper into a labyrinth of degradation from which escape seemed increasingly impossible. The Madam's ledger had become your personal book of the damned, its pages filled with debts that multiplied like pestilence. Room and board, protection fees, fines for imagined infractions, costs for the rags you wore and the slop you ate. Every necessity of survival was twisted into another chain, binding you to this place. The mathematics of exploitation was simple and brutal. You would always owe more than you could earn, trapped in a system designed to consume you completely while keeping you barely alive enough to generate profit. Your body bore the accumulated damage of countless encounters with men who saw you as nothing more than a vessel for their desires and frustrations. Bruises layered upon bruises, creating a map of violence across your skin. Your hands, once perhaps capable of gentleness, were now permanently stained and calloused from the harsh realities of your existence. The mirror, when you dared look into it, reflected a stranger, hollow-eyed and gaunt, aged beyond your years by the relentless brutality of your circumstances. Disease stalked the brothel like a hungry predator, claiming victims with ruthless efficiency. You watched helplessly as women you had shared stories with succumbed to the pox, their bodies ravaged by infections that spread unchecked through the cramped quarters. The stench of sickness mingled with the ever-present odours of unwashed bodies, cheap ale, and human waste, creating an atmosphere so thick with despair it felt like breathing poison. Medical care was a luxury reserved for those who could pay, and even then, the crude treatments available often caused more harm than healing. The psychological toll was perhaps even more devastating than the physical abuse. Each day chipped away at your sense of self until you began to question whether the person you once were had ever truly existed. The madam's constant reminders of your worthlessness, the client's casual cruelty, the society's complete rejection of your humanity, all combined to create a crushing weight that threatened to extinguish the last flickering ember of your spirit. You found yourself adopting the language of your oppressors, thinking of yourself in the degrading terms they used, as if their perception of you was the only truth that mattered. Sleep, when it came, offered no respite. Your dreams were haunted by faces of the men who had used you, their leering grins and rough hands following you into the realm of unconsciousness. You would wake with a start, your heart pounding, only to realize that the nightmare was your waking life. The distinction between dream and reality blurred as your mind struggled to cope with the unrelenting trauma of your existence. Yet even in this pit of despair, there were moments when your humanity refused to be completely extinguished. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, you would hear another woman weeping softly in the darkness, and despite your own pain, you would reach out with a gentle touch or whispered word of comfort. These tiny acts of compassion became acts of rebellion against a world that sought to strip away every trace of your humanity. In choosing to care for another when you yourself were broken, you proved that something essential within you remained unconquered. The bonds you formed with other women in the brothel became lifelines in an ocean of cruelty. You shared not just physical space, but emotional burdens, creating a secret network of support that operated beneath the madam's watchful eye. Stories were passed between you like precious treasures, tales of the lives you once lived, dreams of escape, memories of kindness from a world that now seemed impossibly distant. These connections reminded you that you were more than the sum of what had been done to you, that your worth extended beyond the coin you could generate for your captors. Food, when available, was often spoiled or insufficient, leaving you constantly hungry and weakened. The meager portions of stale bread, thin gruel, and occasional scraps of questionable meat were calculated to keep you alive, but never satisfied. Malnutrition made you more susceptible to illness and slowed your body's ability to heal from the daily violence you endured. The madam used food as another tool of control, withholding meals as punishment and providing slightly better fare only when it served her interests to keep you functional for particularly profitable clients. The changing seasons brought their own particular torments. Winter's cold seeped through the brothel's inadequate walls, leaving you shivering in threadbare clothing that provided little warmth or protection. Summer's heat turned the cramped quarters into a sweltering hell where the stench of human misery became almost unbearable. Spring and autumn offered brief reprieves from temperature extremes, but brought their own challenges. Floods that turned the streets into rivers of filth, or harvest times when the brothel's clientele swelled with workers seeking to spend their meagre earnings on momentary escape from their own harsh realities. The legal system offered no protection or recourse for someone in your position. You existed outside the boundaries of law and social order, considered less than human by those who made and enforced the rules. If you were robbed, beaten beyond the brothel's walls, or even murdered, there would be no investigation, no justice sought on your behalf. You were property in all but name, and property that had been damaged could be discarded without consequence. This legal invisibility reinforced your isolation and vulnerability, reminding you constantly that you had no rights, no voice, no standing in the world beyond these walls. Religious condemnation added another layer to your suffering, as the very institution that preached love and forgiveness branded you as irredeemably sinful. Church teachings painted you as a willing participant in vice, rather than a victim of circumstance and exploitation. This spiritual rejection cut deep, severing your connection to whatever faith might have once provided comfort and hope. You were told that your suffering was deserved, that your degradation was the natural consequence of moral failings, adding the weight of supposed divine disapproval to your already crushing burden of earthly torment. The brothel's hierarchy created additional sources of conflict and pain, as desperate women competed for the madam's favor or slightly better treatment. Some, broken by their circumstances, became enforcers of the very system that oppressed them, perhaps believing that by identifying with their captors, they could gain some measure of protection or privilege. These divisions prevented the formation of unified resistance and ensured that the women remained focused on survival rather than escape or rebellion. As days blended into weeks and weeks into months, time itself became distorted in this place where each moment stretched into eternity while years compressed into a blur of repetitive suffering. You might mark the passage of time by the changing faces of clients, the arrival of new women to replace those who had died or disappeared, or the subtle shifts in the madame's moods and methods. But linear time seemed irrelevant in a world where each day brought the same degradation, the same pain, the same crushing reminder of your powerlessness. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, you clung to whatever fragments of hope you could find. Maybe it was the belief that somewhere beyond these walls, people were living different lives filled with kindness and possibility. Maybe it was the conviction that your suffering had not been meaningless, that bearing witness to this cruelty served some purpose you couldn't yet understand. Or maybe it was simply the stubborn refusal of your spirit to surrender completely, the inexplicable persistence of life force, even in the face of systematic attempts to destroy it. Your story was not unique, but rather one thread in a vast tapestry of exploitation and survival that stretched across medieval Europe and beyond. Countless women found themselves trapped in similar circumstances, their individual voices lost in the larger narrative of a society that valued them only for what could be extracted from their bodies and souls. Yet each story mattered. Each moment of endurance was an act of defiance against forces that sought to reduce human beings to mere commodities. The life of a brothel woman in medieval times was one of unrelenting hardship, marked by disease, violence, social ostracism, and economic desperation that few today can truly comprehend. These women, stripped of dignity and agency by a society that both condemned and depended upon them, survived in conditions that would break even the strongest spirits. Yet somehow, many endured with a resilience that speaks to the fundamental strength of the human will. While we cannot undo the suffering of these forgotten souls, we can honor their memory by acknowledging their humanity and recognizing how far we have come in creating a world where such brutal exploitation is no longer an accepted part of daily life. Their stories remind us that behind every historical statistic lies a real person who laughed, cried, hoped, and suffered, and whose experiences helped shape the world we inhabit today.